I'm Janetta Darley, and I just thought I would share some fun little creative ideas that you can do with your kids or you can do on your own, because we all need creativity. We're going to be working on images like this, little galaxy paintings. I recently taught a in-person class where we did these, and everybody really loved them, and I thought, oh, this would be a fun activity to share with people. So we're starting out, we're going to be using watercolors, watercolor paper, and later on to make the stars, I use acrylic ink. You could also use white acrylic paint or a white gel pen to add those in. So those are just a few of the supplies here. I have over here on this side praying watercolor sets. They're very inexpensive. Usually you'll find them in school supply list. This over here is another set by, I think it's Prima Watercolor. It's under the Art Philosophy name. I really like their sets as well too, but you can really do this with just about anything. Honestly, you may be able to do this with watered down acrylic paint to where it kind of mimics the properties of watercolor. Haven't tried that yet, but it's a thought. So if you're in dire need, try that out. First of all, we're going to start, I taped down my, my paper just because we're going to be using a lot of water and it has a tendency to make it buckle, so this will help a little bit. If you don't have something you can tape it down to, maybe trying a larger sheet of paper and just working on a small area in the center so that you have a bigger drying area around the edges of your paper to help. So you can either take your brush and just kind of get the page wet. I like to just sort of mist it a little bit here. It's just a bit easier, and then brush it back and forth just so that everything, you don't want a lot of puddles on it, but you just want it to have a nice sheen so that your colors, because we're going to be working on a technique that involves color bleeding. So I have 2 glasses of water here. Are they in frame? Not sure. No, they're not. I have 2 glasses of water. I keep one for cleaning, so I try to keep it super clean. The other one is actually I try to keep one for cleaning, so that's going to be your really messier one, and then the other one is for mixing your colors. So you want to keep that cleaner. That way you don't cross-contaminate your colors and they don't become muddy. So we'll start, I like to start with some blue. So not that, you can test it out over here. I like to use a palette as well to move my paints over. That way you can see how thin they're going to be. You can mix colors, especially if you have a limited palette like the Prang. You can mix different varieties of your colors. So there's a little blue, and you notice how it's just moving. Watercolor is going to move wherever the water is. So if you're working on a drier substrate, you won't get that color bleed that you're after. It's just, and this is very, very relaxing too. You could almost say this is a little bit of art therapy, just to watch the colors move into each other. And I'm dipping into my paint and I'm tapping there. I'm going to rinse it off just a little. You do want to make sure that your area stays wet. So if you need to come back in and add a little bit more water around the edges, you can do that too. So now, let's see, let's pick purple. And we can add that right there in the middle. Back with with a little blue, tap that in, see how they blend and just kind of swirl together. Very much like what we see a galaxy in the sky. So we've got a little bit of that. Let's see, maybe a touch of green. You could do this with any colors, you know. Feel free to like move things around as well too while it's still wet. You can kind of manipulate your colors in that way. I think I'm going to go over here for this one. It's called Pond. It's a little sea foamy turquoisey color. Yeah, that looks awesome. I love that. You can also play around with mixing different varieties of your colors if you have a limited palette. Moving it over. You could use a white dinner plate. You could use I guess a plastic, like disposable dinnerware plate would work as well too as a palette for mixing your colors. Let's see, what do we want to do next? Maybe a touch of red. That'd be good. It's very red. Remember, this is just an exercise in having fun and watching the colors blend together. You could turn this into if you're a seasoned homeschooler, or if you're testing out your first go around because the kids are home, then you could turn this into a lesson about space. Anything like that. Let's see, I think I'm going to go back with a little bit more blue and darken some of these areas up. You could do this if you were talking about the Aurora Borealis. You could definitely work on having the colors, I guess, be more in a diagonal area. Okay, so as it comes around the edges here, I like to add in some really deep purple. You had an indigo blue, you could do that as well too. But around these edges, what we're going to do is come back in with some black. And really having a paper towel over here to dry your thing off as well. It's a good idea too. And to also catch any runaways. Sometimes you get it too wet, and you do need to watch out for that. It will become a big mess. There we go. So now I'm going to start dipping into the black paint here. And if you want to maybe mix it with a little bit of the blue, you can get that indigo color. Adds like a different level. Maybe they're not so stark in between each other. And we're just going to come around the edges here and start blending that darkness in that we see from space. Then you can also, bring it a little bit in here. Now, once you start adding that black around all the edges, remember we want to keep this fairly damp so that our colors will still run. But you can start bringing some of the colors back in, pushing them with the black to give yourself more blended areas to where you don't have that, you see that dark line right there? You don't want that so much. You can just gently tap. You really don't want to scrub on the watercolor paper. You will notice that it could start to lift up at that point and create like fuzzies of go for a little bit darker green in this area. And like I said, this isn't just for kids. Adults need creativity too. That's one of my strong, if you've ever sat around and talked to me in person a lot, I'm a firm believer that we all need creativity in our lives, and we've kind of shut it out as adults, thinking that maybe it's just for kids, or I'm not talented enough. It doesn't have to do with talent. Being creative is just an act of making something. Whether you throw it away afterwards, whether you use it, sometimes it's more about the process than it is the product. I think I want some black running through here. Sometimes you can tap it and get a bit more of a random effect. Quite so planned. I want some darker purples. There we go. Like, do we all, when we're sitting here narrating our artwork, start to sound like Bob Ross? Just a happy little galaxy. Not a bad thing. I grew up on Bob Ross. Okay, so now that I've got it to this stage, I'm going to take a break, let this dry, come back in a little bit, and we will see what we do next. So after you let it dry for, a little bit to where there's really no standing water on it, it's still damp, you can come back in and work with colors not being quite as wet as what you were before, and you'll get a little bit deeper coloring if that's what you would like. You're still just kind of dabbing it in. We're only using like the very tip of our paintbrush. You can give it a light mist of water if you want when you first start out, just to help things spread a little bit. But this is also a technique of layering that you have in watercolor, where you let a certain layer of it dry and then come back in. Watercolors are prone to do, because they reactivate when you add water to them again. Most of them do. Now, if you were doing this with acrylic paint and you let it dry, you wouldn't get this lifting that happens if you come back in and work with wet paint on top of dry paint. But if you do it lightly enough, then you won't disturb the colors that you have below. I do want my blacks to be a little bit blacker than what they were. At least right around the edges. So you see me painting that in and then coming back in with just a damp brush to help blend that out. And then you can come grab a color and just sort of tap it in. You really don't want these hard edges that you get that create just definite lines. You want them to be a bit more organic. Now some things like this right here, you see that when it dries, it will create a nice effect, but you do want them to be a little irregular. A little black around the edges. I love it. I love it when the color just runs into one another. And there's going to be moments where this looks like a hot mess. But that's part of the fun. And just sort of little touches. Okay, so I gave this a good hit with my hair dryer just to help speed up some of the drying time. It is still damp. You can feel the coolness to it. I do have a little bit of a wet spot right here where it's puddling, but that can also add to a little bit of effect later when we start with the stars. So right now you have options as far as working and adding the stars in, such as you can see here. One of the methods that I like to use is acrylic ink. Basically, it's just thinned down acrylic paint. You could probably do this with some white acrylic paint and some water. I'll show you when I put it out on the palette here how thin it is. You can also use white paint pens if you want. This is actually a gel pen as well too. But if you're going to go with the gel pen route, or you can use a mixture of all these, make sure that your paper is very dry, because the gel pen will kind of just dissipate and you won't really see it as well. So make sure you shake this up really well. Comes with a little dropper right there. I do like to thin mine down just a little bit. Now you notice I have switched brushes. I don't like to use my watercolor brushes for this because this is a permanent, I guess you could say, medium, as opposed to the water-soluble medium of watercolors. So I just sort of, it's real milky-like. That's kind of what you want it. Dab a bit of it out. And so this is the fun part. This is where the kids, you might want to create a little splatter area room for them. You're going to get your hands dirty if you use this technique. You just take it, splatter right across your paint. And you don't want to do this too much because you'll end up with a bunch of tiny, tiny little dots. But it is good for creating larger ones. You can also tap it down like this, get bigger areas. Now, you see that big blob right there? If you didn't want it to be quite so noticeable, you can come back in with just, a thin little paintbrush, get it into some water, and just sort of blend it out. And it just becomes like a highlight area. Maybe there's a bunch of distant stars clustered together right there. And do that. Give it more of that Milky Way appearance. So just kind of keep layering in your white paint. Another option for making stars, especially if you want to have a little bit more control over them, is to take a toothpick, sort of get some paint on the end of it, and use it as a dotting tool. I think toothpicks are a little bit better, especially if you're working with kids, small children that may not have quite the control over a very fine paintbrush. They can definitely come back in and just dot them in. This is also where, if you're doing a lesson on constellations, you could look those up, look at the designs, talk about where stars are located, add those in. Also, when you have these bigger blobs that may have spread out or aren't quite as vibrant, you can come back in and add a little dot right in the middle of them, and it gives it a glowing effect. And that's basically the same technique that you would use if you had the paint pens coming in. So, there we go. Daubing them in. And that is a Posca pen. Or using now this is a very fine point one. Let's see. And I do find with the gel pens, they aren't quite as good as just like dotting. You may want to give it a little bit of a circular motion. Gel pens also have a tendency to, I don't want to say darken over time, but the white will become whiter as it dries a little bit. So you can also create little shining stars. You want something that's a bit of a starburst. Like that. Or you can kind of create like a little shooting star. Going across the galaxy like that. So this is just a fun technique. It does take some time. You have some dry time, so you can work on one part of it, step away, do another activity, come back to it, or you can use a hairdryer if you want it to go a little faster. But I hope that you guys enjoy it. I hope you get a chance to try it and just get creative. See ya.